welcome. This is Coumba Toure. As you've seen maybe already on the bio, on the flyers, I am the board chair of Trust Africa Foundation, an ambassador to Africans Rising Movement. I'm a writer and publisher of children's books, but also I am someone who have tried and failed and tried again and still trying to set up cooperatives at different levels and seen some success and some less successful things also at different levels. So I am very, very excited about the launch of this initiative. And I am so honored to have all of us here interested, thinking and working to build something different for our continent. And we will be starting with Dr. Chambas because he is really the one of the co-patron of Cooperation Africa. He most recently served as a special representative to the Secretary General and head of the United Nations Office for West Africa and the Sahel. From 2014 to 2021, he has been the president of ECOWAS Commission and Secretary General of the Africa Pacific Caribbean Group of State, and was former Deputy Foreign Minister of Ghana. So this is who we have as co-patron, and we are so honored and happy that he will be doing the opening for us.
Let me start by welcoming you very warmly to the launch of Cooperation Africa. We appreciate the time you have taken off and the interest you have shown in this important initiative. There are many challenges that face Africa and Africans. Among them are the achievement of national peace and security, good governance, inclusive growth, development, and environmental sustainability. The initiative that Cooperation Africa is launching today will create or contribute to achieving inclusive growth and impact positively the lives of African youth and women in particular. Cooperatives allow small producers to improve their market position. They allow farmers to buy their inputs more cheaply and to sell their produce at better prices. They allow consumers to save together in credit unions and then to borrow, thereby accessing finance that might either not be available to them or only at very high cost. They allow those who might not be able to afford a home to gain access to one, provided they team up with others in housing associations. They also allow consumers to access cheap, good quality food, insurance, and other services. Finally, they allow workers to own and manage their own businesses as a democratic collective. In short, cooperatives facilitate inclusive growth and development. Getting access to finance is a problem for many businesses in Africa. And this initiative by Cooperation Africa, building a network of cooperative financing institutions, will encourage women and young people to build cooperative businesses and provide themselves with secure livelihoods, thereby ending systemic underemployment and unemployment, a situation predicted to become acute if nothing is done to address it. Across the world, there are many examples of how cooperatives can and have had positive impact on people's livelihoods. In Asia, Indian farmers have one of the world's largest cooperatives in the Indian Farmers Fertilizer Cooperative. Dairy farmers operating under the Amul brand have enabled India to become the world's largest producer of milk. In Kerala state, the Urulungal Labor Contract Cooperative, started by road and bridge construction laborers in 1925, has become a major builder of infrastructure in that state and is the world's second largest industrial and utilities cooperative. In Japan, farmers have contracts with consumer cooperatives that enables them to have price security and the consumers to have stable supply at affordable prices. In Europe, cooperatives mostly provide affordable finance through credit unions and good quality food at low prices through consumer retail cooperatives. African people have played a special role in the development of credit unions in England, since it was Africans from the Caribbean who set up the first credit union in England in 1964. Of course, in Spain, there is a world-famous Mondragon Cooperative Corporation, which started in 1956 and now comprises a network of around 100 interconnected cooperatives. In the intervening period, it has transformed the Basque region of Spain for the better and become the world's largest industrial and utilities cooperative with an annual turnover of around 12 billion euros, making it the world's largest cooperative union. In the USA, farmers make use of over 30,000 cooperatives to ensure that they can protect their interests, both as buyers and as sellers. Alongside these, a new wave of cooperatives, often led by people of African descent, has begun to emerge. Among them is Cooperative Home Care Associates, which provides home care for the elderly and was started by nurses who felt that they could do better for themselves if they organized their own employment agency to secure contracts. This cooperative is in the Bronx in New York and has been created and has been operating since 1985. Personally, I was a member of a consumer cooperative when I lived in Cleveland, Ohio, in the USA in the early 1980s. And having worked for the UN, I'm still a member of the United Nations Staff Credit Union, UNFCU. The history of cooperatives in Africa is checkered. Many started as state-supported agricultural produce purchasing organizations that flourished in the years immediately after independence. In Ghana, cooperatives were first introduced in 1928 by the colonial government in an attempt to improve the quality of cocoa for export. They were so successful that by 1960, the cooperatives were marketing almost 40% of the entire cocoa crop. Cooperatives fell on hard times, especially during the period of structural adjustment, and have only recently begun to experience a renewal. There has been dynamic growth of credit unions in East Africa, especially in Kenya. The Kenyan credit union system, which specializes in lending for business, has capital reserves many times that of the credit union system in England, which only lends for personal consumption. In the rest of Africa, cooperatives have tended to be small-scale and operate mainly in the agricultural sector. But I'm sure that more cooperatives of all types, especially producer cooperatives in manufacturing, entertainment, financial services, and the tech sector of the economy, would help to make Africa's development more dynamic, African-owned, and inclusive. It is for this reason that I'm happy to associate myself with this initiative. It has the potential to impact on the ability of those normally marginalized, women and youth, to acquire a stake in the expected high level of growth predicted for the African continent and the African economy in the decades ahead. I hope that you who are attending this launch today will join in this initiative. And I hope further that Cooperation Africa will grow in membership and in strength and deliver on all its mission objectives and create a cooperative Africa for the Africa we want. And I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much for that beautiful, but also strong message, already dropping many of the examples and the things that exist around the world. And I think we'll have time to talk more about all of this. I'm not going to take too much before I move to Adote Bin Papo. Adote, I mean, you can look in the chat. We've put some longer bios. When I introduce people, I just give some snippets so that we don't take too much time out of the time that they might use to speak to us. So Adote is one of the two co-chairs of Cooperation Africa, currently teaches economics at the University of Greenwich Business School and former director of the Africa Center, London. But more than that, we know there's been a group of people working tirelessly to pull Cooperation Africa together. And we have to say thank you to Adote for all the time, the inspiration, the work, everything that he really put into bringing this forward and for us to be able to do this launch today. So Adote, the floor is yours for your remark.
Thank you very much indeed, Coumba, thank you. So let me begin with the thank yous. Thank you to those who engaged with the idea for a district bank in Ghana to support cooperatives and eventually gave birth to an initiative to establish a network of institutions to finance cooperatives on the continent. Thank you to those who supported the continental idea, enabling Cooperation Africa to be registered with 54 founding members from 11 countries. Thank you to the members of the Executive Council who have provided their time and expertise on a voluntary basis to make today's launch happen. Thank you to Dr. Mohamed Ibn Chambas for agreeing to be one of our patrons. Thank you to our speakers today who have agreed to share their knowledge about cooperatives with us. And finally, thank you for attending this launch and enabling Cooperation Africa to commence its public journey. Cooperation Africa is registered as a public company, limited by guarantee in Ghana on March 2022, last year, and is a civil society initiative to encourage and support cooperative formation and development in Africa and its diaspora. We want to talk about some of the states and the opportunities and challenges that face Africa. First of all, population and growth. By 2050, 1 out of every 4 people on the continent will be African. Africans will have about 2.37 billion people, half of whom will be under the age of 25. This should constitute a major source of productive, creative energy. They should be capable of producing products and services for themselves and the world. However, they are not likely to be able to do so. Around 60% of Africa's school-aged youth will not be enrolled in school, and around 60% of the youth will be unemployed, with the majority being female. As adults, these young people, especially the females, will be under or unemployed. How will they get the knowledge and skills and opportunities to function effectively in the fourth industrial revolution? As yet, the value of Africa's economic output, the value of Africa's economic output is expected to grow in future decades. Many of the world's fastest economies are and will be in Africa. But given these disappointing figures on education, as well as the prevailing development model, this growth is likely to result in high levels of inequality and dependent development. We look at the argument for cooperatives. On the one hand, we may distinguish between cooperatives as associations that exist to increase their members' bargaining power as buyers or sellers. For example, these may be farmers associating to buy inputs or sell their produce together. Or they may be individuals associating to consume some good or service together in, for example, credit unions, cooperative shops, and housing associations. On the other hand, we can identify cooperatives as being unions or a coming together of individuals in producer or worker cooperatives to form a business and thereby simultaneously create their own employment and their capacity to produce goods and services. Some theorists hold that in developing economies, having more producer cooperatives can have several benefits. These include more national businesses being established, greater production of what nationals eat, drink, wear, listen to, live in, and watch. In short, a stronger national culture. This, in addition to greater environmental sustainability, employment, investment, and development of science and technology. Finally, by increasing the capacity of the economy to provide for national needs and wants, the demand for foreign currency to purchase inputs should fall. The status of the local currency and the balance of payments should benefit as a result. All cooperatives are based on the principle of one person, one vote, and therefore embed the economy in democracy, which should reduce the contradiction between an economic system based on wealth, which can lead to one person, many votes, and many people, no vote, and a political system based on one person, one vote. So what are the likely problems of building cooperatives in Africa? First, the social context. Africans are considered by many to have a collective disposition, evidenced by rules, systems of reciprocal labor for harvesting, house building, implement usage, and novel forms of social insurance. African collective models of financing have become famous the world over. And yet, there's also in Africa an appetite for accumulation through private property, which is done within the context of our very own entrenched systems of authority and hierarchy, underpinned by age, patriarchy, semi-feudal relations, and ethnicity. Meanwhile, in the workplace, the few are used to giving orders and the many to taking them. And yet, or perhaps because of this, there is an appetite for more democracy. In the political context, even as some African leaders claimed building democratic societies based on the principles of free association and free speech of their citizens, many of the same citizens regard their government's behavior as excessively controlling and authoritarian. In the economic context, we see that Africa needs to overcome the distortions imposed on its economy by the centuries of enslavement and export of its human capital, followed by colonialism, and now extended by neocolonialism. Developing African economies places an existential responsibility on leaders to reduce the historical distortions as a necessary condition for improving the standard of living of citizens. However, many African leaders compete with one another instead of joining forces to transform their economies from outward-looking and dependent to Africa-looking and interdependent. Many local businesses, as well as state budgets, have thereby been sacrificed on the altar of so-called free trade and globalization. Development should seek to overcome the distortions of history through industrialization based on the rapid development of science and technology from within, supplemented by knowledge from outside. The proposition is that an economy with a significant number of producer cooperatives will help to achieve this. The African Continental Free Trade Area, set up to facilitate trade between African countries, will most likely initially benefit foreign enterprises, which will now be able to extend their operations across Africa's colonially established internal borders. Meanwhile, local companies are facing great difficulty establishing continental networks, not least the ability to remit revenues across borders without involving foreign currencies. If we look at the cooperative sector itself, we see that by 2019, I beg your pardon, out of 1.3 billion people in Africa, 91 million or 7% of the population were members of cooperatives. However, the global figure is around 12%. Nevertheless, by 2015, cooperatives had created an estimated 5.1 million jobs on the continent. But Africa's cooperatives tend to be small. Most cooperatives are associations for joint procurement, marketing, housing, or financing. Few are businesses to provide self-employment and opportunities for production. If we look at how African cooperatives are perceived, we find that soon after independence, governments established cooperative monopolies to purchase farmers' produce. Farmers soon became aware of the unexplained differential between the prices they received and the foreign currency equivalent the country received. During the period of neoliberal ascendancy in the 1980s, governments withdrew from and then liberalized rural markets. Cooperatives and the rural population went through difficult times, but between 2005 and 2008, there was an uptick in cooperative numbers in Africa. Nevertheless, there is widespread ignorance of the producer cooperative model across the continent. The idea of people pooling their resources and working together in a business owned by them all is not the default idea of a business on the continent. African cooperatives suffer from a few weaknesses. Recent studies have indicated that the African cooperatives do not have strong networks from the grassroots upwards to the national level, nor are the cooperatives as autonomous as they should be. Also, the bulk of people trained in cooperative affairs are not actual cooperators, but instead staff of the government departments regulating cooperatives. Those school leavers who are trained are not provided with enough of the support they would need to set up their own cooperative businesses. So, what is Cooperation Africa's agenda? Cooperation Africa, as we've said, is a civil society initiative to encourage and support cooperatives in Africa and its diaspora. Its founding members are business people, academics, and activists. Our vision is a vast network of cooperative enterprises providing Africans with secure livelihoods and high standards of living and well-being. The first phase in our plan is to build a membership organization of like-minded people. In the second, we will encourage members to join or establish cooperative financial bodies in which they'll be able to invest. Finally, these cooperative financing institutions will support cooperative formation and development. To achieve these outcomes, we've created 3 program areas. First, problem-solving research leading to informed advocacy and awareness raising among the public and policymakers. Second, the mobilization and channeling of our members and philanthropic resources to build a robust and supportive financial underpinning for cooperatives. Finally, education and training in cooperative history and business management. In about 6 weeks, we shall commence a series of monthly webinars that will discuss cooperative business principles and practice. We will inform you exactly of when this will begin. So, on behalf of the founding members, I call on you here today to join us by becoming a member, join us and help establish cooperative financing bodies where you live, join us and invest in cooperative enterprise, join us and create your own cooperative businesses, join us and help grow cooperatives in Africa and its diaspora. Just join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adote, being Papo. For those of you who also came a little late, and this is one of the co-chairs of Cooperation Africa, and you heard it. If you didn't hear anything from this meeting, you heard join us. This is the time for you to join. Maybe let's put it on the chat right away where people can join so they can register, they can ask questions. We have to try. We have to give it a chance. And those of us who are already organized as cooperative, this is the time to join and make something larger, something bigger, because it has been said that there are many already cooperative, but many times we don't have yet that level of large Pan-African cooperative that we really need to be as powerful as we need to be. I'm going to move on. Thank you so much, Adote. Thank you again for this address. It was just very, very beautiful. I'm going to move very quickly to Mr. Brian Kagoro. Brian, it's so beautiful to see you. It's been a long time. So welcome and thank you. Brian has worked on the excluded in Africa for many decades with a view to how to include them equitably in the economy and around issues of economic justice. So he has extensive experience on contemporary approaches and challenges in building economic justice in African development. I will not say more. We will paste his bio on the chat, so you will see that he didn't want us to say much on him. Maybe running away from putting all of them actually running away from putting the focus on who they are. You need to Google them. They are powerful people on this panel, all of them. So Brian, you take us away. You have your slide on, and I'll make a little sign when it's time to stop.
Thank you, Coumba. It's impossible to follow Dr. Chambas and Adote, who are
just try. You just try
on this matter. But I would like to acknowledge my fellow panelists and to congratulate Adote and the leadership of Cooperative Africa for this bold step. I think this we all know, that Africa is wealthy. But what Adote and Dr. Chambas have begun to tell us is how cooperatives help us to connect our continent's wealth to development. And that's how much it is worth, we're told. Over 1.4 trillion over the past 30 years lost. And I've just put the sort of things that we produce or that we have. We are spoiled for wealth, and yet we have some of the poorest populations. But now we have an opportunity. And that opportunity is to deal with the poverty trap. I do not want to go into these details, except to indicate that one of the fundamental things that we're hearing is that the question of leadership is key, and the question of skills of education is key, but undergirding some of the challenges that we face is this phenomenon that many comrade feminists on this platform have been teaching me and others for years, which is that unemployment and jobless growth are indeed phenomenon, but the feminization of poverty as a very specific phenomenon, especially with regards to our imaginaries of future cooperatives. Of course, there are grander and bigger global risks that have been transferred to Africa, such as the climate emergency, the energy crisis, land grabs that Coumba, you and others have been working on. Professor Amina Mama has done brilliant work on militarization, and some of you have been working on radicalization and extractivism. And how does this all fit into the question of cooperatives in Africa, this militarization of development of society and economies, this financialization, extractivism, and pauperization, if you like, of our people? How might cooperatives in this context lead to transformative local economic development and some form of regional developmentalism and integration, and the projection, if one takes the examples given by Dr. Chambas, of Africa within the global economy on our own terms? Clearly, when we often talk, we talk about these big factors, right? Big infrastructure, diamonds, oil, and commodities of this nature. I want to suggest that the new interest in cooperatives is both benign and malign, or malign. When you read in the EU Strategy for International Development, 2014 to 2020, that cooperatives are critical local private sector actors, and you link it, of course, to the demonstrable value of cooperativism that we discussed, which is promoting social capital, improving household incomes, savings, catalyzing innovation, and stimulating growth, as well as territorial development and creation of particular jobs in neglected contexts, and addressing social needs that respond to specific groups, or addressing questions of diversity, equity, and inclusion, economic agency of women, of minorities, from poor backgrounds of youth, ethno, regional, and religious minorities, and poor classes, the working class and peasantry. And that cooperatives ordinarily would be that organic platform for achieving integrated and sustainable development. I want to just underscore that as we listen to the speakers today, both the historical, the reflective piece, and the prospective, we ought to emphasize the role of cooperatives' contribution, as Adote has already done, to, if you like, intangible assets, and also to questions of corporate accountability, corporate social responsibility, climate change, and the question of business and human rights. I wanted to take a step back and reflect to what Brother Rodney, Walter Rodney, referred to in order to situate this moment of cooperative revival on the continent within the global political economy. Number one, I think it's already said that the SAPs, or structural adjustment programs, led to disinvestment in rural macro enterprise development. It removed subsidies from basic commodities, and as a result, what we ended up with is a progressive poor access to goods and services by Africans within the rural and peri-urban areas. And we ended up in a situation that many of you have described, which is that we produce what we do not eat and eat what we do not produce, from a basic survival question. And of course, since SAP, there's been that progressive erosion of household incomes and savings and purchasing power. UNCTAD has done brilliant work looking at this work. Pervasive unemployment, underemployment is also linked to the rise of violent crimes, violent extremism, this idea that Walter Rodney referred to as poor people preying on other poor people. we have created, if you like, a society in which progress on books is not translated as progress in the social psyche. So that the progress we see in technology and its appropriation, if one links it to the international economic debt, climate and energy crisis, or the crisis of neoliberalism, and what I think both Dr. Chambas and Dr. referred to as the concentration of wealth in the hands of a minority, that minority that Samir Amin described as the global plutocracy, we realize that what's happening is the global north is passing on its burdens of ecological overreach and excessive consumption to the global south. And the response, subconscious response of young people who are unemployed or underemployed in the global south has been to migrate, both within Africa and to migrate to Europe. And Europe faces a fundamental challenge that the chickens have come home to roost. So Africa's poor classes have become a continental and global concern, whether it's through migration, insecurity, and conflict, and hence a subject of global development conversation. Some have suggested that we need to build back better, or build back better in terms of the UN mantra. Well, we cannot build back, and this is my argument. The thing that we should not be doing is building back a system that produced this challenge in the first place. Efficiency is not the challenge we face. It is transformation that's fundamental. And that's why this initiative is key. And those African classes that others say reflect Euro-American classes and the African oligarchs and predatory elites that have captured our states and used in order to defend their privilege, will take any developmental trajectory as long as it sustains, if you like, their privilege. And that this has led to popular uprising, which Coumba, I think you and others have been talking about. So we're situating cooperatives within this particular system of dependency. That dependency has grown from Euro-American to Chinese to Indian and other consumption choices and patterns, so that within the main economy, we are producing goods, as we have historically done, to meet needs of others. Focusing on are unlikely to be critical, of course, to the development of capitalism in the digital age, let alone the ceramic age in the global economy. And that the land grab that we have seen over the last 2 decades essentially maintain and reduce poverty in the sector that we want to transform. And that this focus on raw materials, the loss of patents to critical local economies, local economic products, that local procurement and local content laws have not hardly developed. Look at the history of that. I think Adote described of cooperatives in Africa, whether it's in the era following the Second World War in South Africa, Zambia, Malawi, Tanzania, Ghana, or the immediate post-independence moment in the 1960s that were cooperation from above, transacted, led, guided by states, or the period immediately following the imposition of structural adjustment programs, picking up the fallout from, I think, neoliberalism gone rogue, or in the period that has coincided with the COVID pandemic, we see fundamentally that there is a radical imagination of cooperatives that's required, right? And that radical reimagination must contest 3 things. Number one, must contest the logic of state control, supervision, and surveillance of cooperation. Number two, it must contest the imperial knowledge and dominance of alien and foreign knowledge, in particular, the European type, in the construction of both the form, the content, the governance, and direction of African cooperation within the economy. And this is what happened. I do not want to spend time on the control and coloniality of power and how state control led to all these things and the disinvestment, donorization, vertical control, accomplice of imperial and state elite interests, popular base erosion that happened in the 1990s, and ultimately the structural adjustment, the financial, and how liberalization led to withdrawal and reduction of government support. But that led to the disconnect between local economy or popular people's economy and the state or state elite type economy, which was externally focused on providing goods and services to external world, including the Europeans, the Americans, and others. And therefore, the autonomy of cooperatives, born out of a senseless cut and paste exercise, is something that I think we can debate and we can discuss on. And linked to this, obviously, the failures were not only external. Our change readiness in the moment of liberalization used to state control, used to state leadership, used to state provisioning, and also used to forms of subsidy and patronage. There are many reasons why I think both liberalization and state control failed. Clearly, there was also this idea that poor governance, corruption, and disintegration became key factors born out of the neoliberal moment. Key factors when individuation and individualization of the production mode, as well as the governance mode within the cooperatives, became key. I want to suggest to you that despite these problems, cooperatives have been historically the most practical way to empower women in Africa in a variety of ways. It's through creating the organized and tech collective actions about issues of mutual interest and benefit, or helping women to access capital resources, create opportunities, as well as increase their economic and social power. Cooperatives have also facilitated and strengthened women's economic agency, financial inclusion, and autonomy through providing access to credit and other financial services, involvement and direct control in decision-making regarding their financial welfare and well-being, training in business and leadership skills, and guaranteeing equal rights in economic decision-making. Tragically, although we've had ministers, although we have policies and acts on cooperatives, these have remained on the periphery of the imagination of African states going would look like. And centrally, if you want to analyze whether my statement is correct, look at the structure of the tax policies in each of our African countries, the sort of constraints from a fiscal perspective that are placed on cooperatives, never mind the political restraints, whether cooperatives want to import machinery or cooperatives want to remit, to export, or enter into partnerships. The governance structures dictated by most cooperative legislation, including those that came in the post-apartheid moment, were tainted and contaminated by a coloniality of perspective. So I want to suggest that COVID-19 has had this significant adverse impact that we all talk about, and that cooperatives have been losing income, their share of markets, regional, global, and national, and have had greater difficulty in accessing credit and finance. And what Adote has suggested to us and Dr. Chambas is there are several opportunities, especially in this COVID moment and the ongoing war in Ukraine. Those are created by advances in technology, which enable the digital economy, which envisages digital technologies such as the internet, mobile devices, and etc., being used more by cooperatives. Here is the little downside. Access to technology, to digital infrastructure remains poor for people who are the highest users of the cooperation model.
Thank you.
And this is linked to the national development program. So the opportunity must be noted, right? And providing and promoting services, exploring new market models, building stronger relationships, revising organizational structures. If you ask me what needs to be done, and I'm about to end, throw away the regulatory frameworks, throw away the fictitious attempt to reproduce Euro-American organizational forms. Today, we call certain things philanthropies, small businesses, and cooperatives of society, production beyond borrowed models. And this essentially means we suffer the constraints almost in a delayed fashion that both the Americans, the Europeans, the Canadian, and everybody else that we're begging and borrowing these models from suffers. It is as though African intelligentsia, African intellectuals, lawyers, anthropologists, sociologists, and political scientists are unable to imagine organizations that suit into their social cultural context, as well as are able to optimize productivity. The Chinese did not follow, strictly speaking, Western forms as they were emerging. Of course, they have had to comply with other things. I want to suggest that, therefore, the challenge facing us that Adote and Dr. Chambas are calling us to, and for those of you who are here or cooperative. Number two is to realize as we do research that there are intersections between praxis, institutional design, regulation, and the legacy of colonialism in Africa. And that there's new forms that, and that therefore, if we're to reimagine, to disrupt it, especially the institutional form. And that cooperative governance, if we don't, will become a new site of both emancipation as well as exploitation and objectification of African poors based on access to technology, access to particular types of knowledge, and etc. So ultimately, in unraveling and exploring and exploiting this, I am suggesting that our knowledge must accept that neoliberalism failed as a model. Sides. This idea that a particular type of private sector is the only one that can to be disrupted. Madam Chair, and what is the success of course? What are the opportunities? Ultimately, this is a question of leadership. And that question of leadership has three aspects, and I will shut up. Number one.
You have gone through beyond your time, but
okay, let me just shut up then.
Yeah. you will get to talk again soon, as we will get the how do you call it, the questions. Thank you so much. This was really, really important to hear. And I want to just give a few minutes, just pause and hear from those who have been listening to us, from, Dr. Chambas, Adote, and Brian, religiously listening. If people have feedback, questions, especially about Cooperation Africa, because it is the biggest subject, the building of something new and the joining, but also everything that has been said so far. We can take one or two questions, make a break from the presentation, and then move forward. I did not see in the Q&A many questions. There was no question in the Q&A. But is there anyone who wants to take the floor? You can just raise. I think you are able to unmute yourself.
Yes, Coumba, we do have a hand raised. I'm going to allow that colleague to speak. Please give them 1 second.
Thank you so much.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for this presentation so far. It's been phenomenal. I had just a brief question about the role of cooperatives and how it factors into a lot of the activity that we're seeing now with this development of the AFCFTA and national discussions and continental-wide discussions about what it takes to move the African economies forward. And my observation is that the role of cooperatives, both historically and presently, has not, at least in many of the spaces that I've been in, factored into these discussions about trade between and amongst countries, about connecting local economies, smallholder farmers, et cetera, to the national, regional, and continental level. So I guess I'm curious as to your thoughts on how the role of cooperatives can be incorporated further into these discussions about transforming our local, national, regional economies. As they're developing policies at the continental level, it seems to be just an area that has not really gotten much attention, yet it has been so critical to our lives and livelihoods for generations. So thoughts on how this can be integrated into a lot of these discussions nationally and continental wide with AFCFTA, et cetera, and how this can be a bigger factor of consideration from a policy standpoint and even from an advocacy standpoint. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Amara, for being with us. So great to see you here. Do we have other hands raised or the questions? Or should
we have just another one left. I think we can only take just one more. I'm going to pass the mic over to Juliet.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this. My name is Juliet Kagoro, and I'm with the Banker Ladies in Toronto. I'm with a group with Dr. Caroline Hossein. And my question is really about for Cooperation Africa, right? Is there a plan to have specific cooperatives, both in Africa and in the diaspora, that are actually picked as examples that the organization will work with to get them to a level of success that speaks to the power of cooperatives pragmatically, right? We talk a lot about, how great cooperatives are, how we imbibe this from our grandmothers and our mothers, but we also live in, a capitalist world where results are more eloquent in telling a story. So is there any plan by Cooperative Africa to really have clear milestones to say these are maybe 10 organizations over a time frame that we want to build to that level, like the Mondragon of Africa or something, to show that this model, is scalable and can do and be the alternative to the capitalist model, the extractive capitalist model. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to give the floor back to Adote on the organizational question, and then back to Brian just to give a few words before we go back to listening to our panelists. First, Adote.
Right. Thank you. I'll try and be very, very brief on this. One of the things that I'll give a kind of interim answer. One of the things which we want to do is to really understand the circumstances in which cooperatives operate in Africa. We have plans to do some serious research. As we said, we have some problem-solving research onto what is going on the ground. I can tell you a couple of things, however, even before some of those results have come in, but those are some of the things we want to focus upon. The first one is the legal framework. So it would be very useful to have a very comprehensive study on what is the legal framework around cooperatives or for cooperatives in Africa. I give you an example of the one place where we've had a little bit of experience in Ghana. So in Ghana, we have a company code. It was published, it was enacted in 1919, and it doesn't mention cooperatives. So that legally, you cannot have a business that's a cooperative. Yeah. So the question becomes, how common is that across the continent? We need to find out. And then there are many of the other regulations under which cooperatives work. So the distinction I made between sort of associations, right, which are cooperative associations, which are there to help businesses or individuals, as distinct from cooperatives, which are kind of unions of individuals to create their own businesses, I think is pertinent here. The first form of cooperative is quite common, and that is what is pushed a lot. The second type of cooperative is not pushed very much. There may be reasons, we may have our own reasons for why that may be we may have our own explanations rather for why that may be the case, but that is the case. And I think that that's something that we need to look at. So we need to begin with the legal environment, and then also obviously once we have that, the training that is provided to people who want to set up cooperatives, that also becomes an issue. Okay, the question about, are there examples that one wants to focus upon and highlight and so on? I would say that it's, in a sense, it's the other way around. So what we're trying to begin with is the financial institutions. And one of the lessons of Mondragon is that it was successful in part because of its financial institution, or because of the bank, right? The Caixa Popular, which is the Popular Bank, which became the third cooperative in the Mondragon grouping. And that bank was central to the development of the other cooperatives. So they grew out of that. So what I would say is that what we're trying to do is to establish the financial institutions on the ground. That is the main thing. And then from that, one would begin to support cooperatives to grow. And I feel that, it would certainly be possible for cooperatives to grow with the necessary ingredients, the enabling environment, the finance, and the education and training. That with those, we can get cooperatives that will, in the fullness of time, remember Mondragon started in 1957, so they've had some time at it. The second largest cooperative, the one in producer cooperative, the one in India, started in 1927. So people have had time to do it. So in fullness of time, I don't see why we shouldn't have cooperatives of that size across Africa and in its diaspora. But we need to begin to provide the key ingredients, the necessary ingredients to make that happen, I would suggest. So that's my kind of answer to those questions that were posed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Brian, I'll ask you just to hold on. There are a few questions for you on the chat. We will take those at the end. I just want to move and bring on Professor Jessica Gordon Nembhard. She's a leading scholar on African American cooperative and wrote the definitive work on the history called Collective Courage, tracing the history of African American cooperative endeavors from the 1780 to 2012. Wow. Professor Jessica, please come on.
Hi, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. Congratulations to the organizers and panelists. I'm actually a little intimidated to follow the panelists that have already and to anticipate Carolyn coming on, but I'll do my best to live up to the high standards of the panelists. So thanks everybody for having me. I do want to do a quick acknowledgement of the original stewards of the land. I want to acknowledge our elders, acknowledge our ancestors, and especially to recognize those who continue to labor without just compensation, those who practice resistance, especially using solidarity and cooperative economics for liberation. So I want to talk about some of what I found when I started researching what Black Americans have really done throughout history in terms of solidarity and cooperation. But I also wanted to motivate us a little bit with one of my favorite quotes from W.E.B. Du Bois from 1933. He said, we can, by consumers and producers cooperation, establish a progressively self-supporting economy that will wield the majority of our people into an impregnable economic phalanx. And I suspect that that's partly why we're all here. And so I want to remind us that we, that this is a worthy goal and that it's something I think that we can accomplish. I'm trying to talk a little slower for the translators, but I'm a New Yorker, so I tend to talk fast. And I'm sorry, translators, that quote was not in the document I shared with you. I forgot to add it until now, so I apologize for that. So there's what my book looks like, Collective Courage. As Coumba already said, it's a book about survival, resistance, prosperity through economic cooperation for Black Americans from the late 1800s on up to the 21st century. I also helped a colleague of mine do a current study of Latinx co-ops, because we also need, it's not just African-American, but other diaspora groups that we need to learn more about. So I was trying to think of what the most important things to talk to you guys about. So I'm mostly just trying to let you know some of the things that I've learned and then give you some examples of the history that I found. So probably one of the more important lessons I learned from the study and the research I did was how important education, co-op education and study groups, training, but learning together, learning from each other. I'm talking about, a lot of people, when I say education, think I'm talking about, getting a degree or going to a public school or something, but I'm really talking about learning, co-learning, information sharing, that kind of thing. And it turned out that probably 90 or more % of the co-ops that I learned about how they started with some kind of study group, people coming together to learn together. And that creates so many other aspects so important to co-ops, right? Creates a sense of trust, a sense of solidarity, that seeing themselves as learning organizations, which co-ops are, that kind of thing. The other really important thing I noticed as I started to put together the history and try to see patterns was how important it was to have organizational supports. So when there were strong Black organizations doing co-op development and understanding economic democracy as a liberatory structure, we had more deliberate co-op organizing and more co-ops developed. So that's another one, and I have a couple more slides to go into that and more significance. And then also the significance of community involvement. So it's not just that co-ops are values-based businesses owned by members, people in the community who are members, but also even members' families and other people in members' communities, even if they're not in the co-op, right? Having a sense of solidarity with them, community members understanding what's happening in the co-op was also very important. And then, of course, we've been talking about the necessity to pool resources. That provides access to non-exploitative resources. So that's another, I looked through history about financing, how these co-ops were financed. And so many of them, it was just about poor people putting in incremental amounts each month that they could afford and using those pooled resources to do what they needed to do in bulk or to leverage resources from other places. And again, community involvement was important because sometimes community members, other community organizations also helped to provide access to non-exploitative resources. And then, of course, we've been talking about how important the democratic participation, sharing of power, including voices, et cetera. I also could go for hours talking about Black women's leadership and how important that has been and the role of Black women in the Black co-op movement, but also the broader US co-op movement. And then also another lesson was how important keeping young people participating, starting young, getting young people involved in their own co-ops, getting them involved in the adult co-ops. And again, that helps with the sustainability and the continuity of co-ops. I also learned, how universal, right? Obviously for this group, we already know that other groups and all indigenous groups and early African civilizations, have practiced mutual aid and economic cooperation. I didn't realize it again till I started studying it. When I looked at what some of the very early African American co-ops were doing, especially among enslaved people, they were using notions of mutual aid, collectivism, the commons that they had, that came with them from their African ancestors to do something in this horrible, harsh, exploitative world that they were brought to. And so this whole notion really is not, not European, which when I started looking at it, everybody was looking at it, as somebody else said, based on European values and ideals. And what I realized was Black folks were using some of that, but they were bringing their own cultural values, their own heritage into, and recognizing that this was a long history throughout history. Really, every population and every era of U.S. history and every continent in every era of human history and every continent in the world has actually practiced this. And we all can, we've learned from all the different traditions. And then, as I said earlier, how important community and organization are. The most number of co-ops that I found in Black American history were started when we had strong, large Black organizations dedicated to co-op promotion and co-op education and co-op development. So starting in the 1880s with the Colored Farmers National Alliance and Cooperative Union, which is still considered probably one of the largest Black organizations in the United States. And it was a labor union, a co-op development organization. It was a populist political party as well. And so it combined all those movements in order to help create multiple different kinds of cooperatives throughout mostly the southern part of the United States. In the 1930s, you then had the Young Negroes Cooperative League, which tried to do similar things, bring young Black people together to do co-op development, to educate young Black folks about cooperatives. We know the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, also a labor union, but also the Ladies Auxiliary in particular, was focused on doing co-op education, co-op study groups, and starting co-ops. The Black Panther Party, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, which is still our largest regional Black co-op development organization. So again, all these, having these organizations dedicated to doing co-op promotion was really important. And then the community support I talked about already. But it comes in many different forms, including donations, and then to co-ops, grants to co-ops, but also defending the co-ops. And we know, because we live in capitalist society and racist capitalist society, that many of the co-ops were preyed upon and white supremacists tried to stop them, but often they were able to continue because communities defended them, whether it was financially, politically, or actually, physically with their own bodies and protection, that kind of thing. Here's a quick list of some of the major Black organizations that were doing co-op development. I guess you can read it. I'll highlight some of them. The Universal Negro Improvement Association with Marcus Garvey, it wasn't their major project, but they did have a major economic development project. And within that, they had some notion that these needed to be solidarity, economic, jointly owned, and hopefully democratically run businesses. They didn't get very far on their economic project, but still they're part of this mix. There's the Colored Merchants Association, which was actually a co-op that was created by the National Black Business Association, that was started by Booker T. Washington. And again, the model was the capitalist model, but they realized they needed a cooperative, a second level cooperative to help support their Black grocery stores. And so they had to create the co-op, the Colored Merchants Association. The National Association of Colored Farmers through the 20s and 30s were making sure that farmers and farm workers could get good prices for their work, could get access to supplies, things like that. Then fast forward to the 1960s and 70s, we've got the Poor People's Corporation, the Black Panthers, who I'll talk about a little bit more, the creation of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund, which is continuing to the present, over 50 years old. The Nation of Islam also started some co-ops, and then we've got groups now, green worker cooperatives, combining, looking at environmental sustainability with worker ownership. Cooperation Jackson, looking at a whole municipal strategy for Black co-op ownership and development of co-ops. Us Lifting Us in Atlanta, and even the Movement for Black Lives, which has its economic justice platform, which is chock full of support and ideas for economic cooperation. Sorry, I guess now I'm backing up. So why, how do we understand that whole long list of Black organizations that were supporting co-ops? Well, we know, or I found that there were 3 major periods of prolific Black co-op activity: the 1880s, 1930s and 40s, and 1960s and 70s. I already kind of went through the list of what organizations were around in those periods. But we know also that especially the 1880s and the 1930s were economic survival issues. Those were depression, especially in the 1930s. We know that all the periods, or especially the 1880s and the 1960s, were periods of race consciousness and transition. And even though a lot of the focus in both those periods was more on political rights, the economic justice and cooperation was heavy on the minds of Black activists. I'm also adding the 2020s because I think we're in another period of activism, and being part of this launch of Cooperation Africa makes me think the 2020s really are going to be another prolific period. We also have the 1880s were similar to the 1960s in needing economic independence in order to politically be active, and in order to advocate for civil rights, we needed more economic independence, and we got that through economic cooperation, cooperatives, and mutual aid. And then for really all the periods, including now, these, as I said, Black organizations that are focused on economic liberation. The 1880s, I just want to highlight one more thing there. So important was this collaboration between populism, labor, co-ops, and civil rights. So the early labor unions, like the Knights of Labor, were working for worker control that included co-op development, especially worker co-ops. They were connecting the populist movement, which was arguing for political rights for Blacks and white small farmers and laborers. They connected that with the women's rights movement, and that connection. And I've been arguing lately that we need to get back to that kind of ecosystem thinking, right? That all our movements need to be connected and need to be connected with cooperation, economic cooperation, and building solidarity economies. And then, as I said, education matters. Again, we had groups doing study groups, learning together, learning cooperative economics together, doing study tours and learning journeys, going to other co-ops to see what they were doing and how they were doing it. I was able to find Black leaders throughout these periods who are writing about it and promoting cooperative education. So even though they might have to use mainstream co-op literature, they were connecting it to how it made sense for African Americans. So quickly, in the time left, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of these organizations and co-ops that I've been mentioning. So the Young Negroes Cooperative League in the 30s, started by George Schuyler from the Pittsburgh Courier, who put a call, he was a columnist, he put a call in his newspaper that young Negroes needed to save the race by using economic and studying economic cooperation. He and Ella Jo Baker and about 25 other African-American youth then founded the organization in December of 1930. So just at the beginning and the height of the Great Depression, they're saying, if we want to survive, we really need cooperatives. The mission was to provide cooperative education and co-op incubation to Black communities led by young people, controlled by young people and women. And so again, they had this connection. They had a long-term goals, right? Starting small, forum in each community with 5 or more members. then cooperative enterprises where every council existed, and then cooperative wholesale in states, and then regional wholesale establishments, cooperative banks in every community, and then factories, presumably cooperative factories to produce the things they needed to supply the smaller local co-ops. So a really beautiful notion about an ecosystem, even though it was a short-lived organization, huge impact on the Black community and co-ops that started in the 30s. We also have Gary, Indiana, which started with a study group during the Great Depression, and then eventually created co-op education courses in the high school, and then started the study group, the Women's Guild, and then a food co-op. And then they also then had added a credit union, and then a second food co-op and a gas station. So again, this ecosystem notion. But the other thing important was that they recognized how important education was, and creating these adult courses in the night school of the high school, local high school, was important. They also talked about how important the Women's Guild was, keeping things going and moving and that kind of thing. They created one of the largest Black grocery stores during the Great Depression. They were able to even give dividends back. They created a student ice cream parlor co-op, things like that. And again, this whole ecosystem to show that, right, they could thrive, not just survive, but thrive with a whole co-op system. Also in the 30s, Cooperative Industries of DC, I just wanted to mention quickly because that started out as a women's worker cooperative, employing unskilled, unemployed women doing sewing, canning, and broom making. And then they actually rapidly became sort of one of our first hybrid or multi-stakeholder co-ops, as they were able to get a government grant to buy a farm. And so then they did farm to city connections, and became a consumer co-op, as well as undergirded by these worker co-ops. So a really interesting model this time, started, run, led, organized, and owned mostly by Black women.
Thank you.
I keep mentioning the Black Panther. Yeah, I'll go quickly now. Just two more examples. The Black Panther Party is really important because that one is known more for their anti-police brutality work, but really important because they were actually doing intercommunalist community organizing and community economic development through cooperatives and collective ownership. And again, they were able to do clothing, food, plumbing, newspaper, cooperative newspaper, communal housing, healthcare. And so again, this notion of an ecosystem, that we need to control our own systems as collectively and democratically as we can. Somebody already mentioned cooperative home care associates. And then just quickly, during COVID, we also have some really new exciting co-ops developed. Chai Fresh Kitchen in Chicago is women and minority-owned business worker co-op. Started during the middle of COVID, but they saw a need for delivering freshly cooked, healthy food in the cultural traditions of people. And so that's where the future is going. And then another real futuristic that started during COVID is the Drivers Cooperative in New York City. And again, they're competing with Uber and Lyft. So they're taking that notion of new technology and using it to make sure that the workers and the consumers benefit, rather than outside owners and corporate owners. So thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm very excited. Congratulations to Cooperation Africa.
Wow, thank you so much, Professor Jessica Gordon Nembhard. This is massive work. We need to digest even more, I'm sure. There's a lot of questions. Please put them on the chat for her. And I'm going to move swiftly and give the floor to Professor Caroline Hossein. He has specialized in the activities of the Bankers Lady across America, showing how their informal lending organization have served to provide avenue to especially women to gain foothold in the commercial world. She has published extensively on that and the Black economy, not the Black market, but the economy of the Black people in America and elsewhere. So Professor Caroline Hossein, you have the floor. And we have a guest, I'm sure you've seen that coming up and down, but yeah, we're managing.
Just wanna. Let's figure out how to.
We can see the screen.
Oh, you can. Yeah, I was just trying to maximize it.
Yeah.
Can't figure out how to do that here. I can't seem to be able to do that. Well, everyone can see it, I suppose, and we're running short on time. Blessings and greetings, and thank you, Coumba, for moderating, which is never an easy task. And I'm really grateful and humbled by Professors Amina Mama and Professors Adote Bing Papo for inviting me to share a little bit about a phenomenon that everyone on this call will know about, and who I like to see as the original cooperators, who are what we call in the Americas the banker ladies. So women who organize informal cooperative banks, and hoping that as Africa leads the way in making room for cooperativism in our economic system, that part of that also includes the very fine women across the world in Africa as well as the diaspora to be a part of that movement of cooperativism. So my name is Caroline Shenaz Hossein. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto. And I am founder of what is called the DICE Collective, Diverse Solidarity Economies. Jessica Gordon Nembhard, who you just heard, is one of my mentors, and also very active in this DICE Collective, has done a lot of advising of me to make sure that we and our members are pushing for cooperativism, underlining a very feminist intention as we do this work. You can see that I've been publishing quite a bit. I'm happy to share all of the literatures. I don't have time to move it, but a lot of the work that we've been doing is really to push forward this idea of ROSCAs. You don't need any definitions of what a rotating savings and credit association is for the large part of the people here, but they're mutual aid systems. People voluntarily come together to form these money banking systems, in Ghana known as Susu, other parts of the world like Congo, Restourne, Monet in Ivory Coast, Lodge in Barbados. But there's a whole vernacular of what these cooperatives are called. And what we're finding, and what I hope to impress on people here, is that we need to start using theory in political economy and the way that we think about cooperativism, that we start looking at things like the Black social economy, where we point to actual cooperativism that is happening below the surface, where people have to seek refuge outside of formal systems to be able to manage their livelihoods. And a lot of the work that I'm doing in this presentation is based on a book that I've been working on for about a decade called The Banker Ladies, speaking to hundreds of chief banker ladies, women who represent groups that can range anywhere from 8 to hundreds, literally. In Haiti has some of the biggest cooperative money banking systems known as Sol, like the earth. But there is an abundance of theory and literature. You saw Jessica just now, really grounded theory, thinking about we should be enacting ideas coming out of the diaspora and Africa when we think about cooperativism. it's far too easy to keep pointing to Eurocentric understandings of cooperativism. And so I was very happy with the first speaker really grabbing hold of Walter Rodney's body of work. But there is another economist by the name of C.Y. Thomas, who has been a dependency theorist, who've been talking about convergence theory, this idea of really amplifying local economic development to thwart a world extractive system. I don't have time because I want to make sure that Virginie is able to speak after me, and to have some conversation if possible, but happy to share the PowerPoint and my findings later. But what I really wanted to impress upon folks here today is that the users who use these systems across the Caribbean and the Americas, these ROSCA systems and the various names they're known as, have a deep appreciation, a loyalty to this. And the literature, Portfolios of the Poor, found that often in these financial diaries of the very marginalized, ROSCAs keep topping as the most important financial device that people tend to use around the world. And in the Caribbean context, where my family is from, Caribbean bankers, actually, commercial bankers, imagine this, are actually copying these ROSCA systems to develop new clientele base. So that at least there's an acknowledgement of the value and the potential of informal cooperative banks. And I'm accumulating hundreds of quotes from women across the Americas who are really intent on showing how Susu, box hand, the tontines are really advancing their livelihoods. And most of it has to do with the trust and reciprocity that these institutions are based in, very similar to cooperative institutions. And that's why I want to be, DICE Collective wants to support Cooperation Africa, because we really do believe that the cooperative space right now, as we know it, has been so fixated on what is formal that they leave out the informality of cooperation, which is really at its roots. And what's important about these ROSCA systems and why they're so relevant is that many of the cooperatives that you know about today started off informally. And they have always been sort of this opt-out card when there has been lots of problems in a society, whether it's clientelism, racism, any kinds of forms of business exclusion. And what's important is that we start to show gratitude and recognize these but these humane economic systems that we have always known. So right now I'm at a point in my research where I'm not accepting that these informal institutions are not seen, but instead we should start showing gratitude for the banker ladies who come from across the world, who migrate to developed parts, quote unquote, developed parts of the world, and they bring these technologies with them. And I penned something, Alicia Trotz, who's done a lot of work on and thinking through how diasporic people meet people in the Caribbean and Africa, really wanted us to amplify the gratitude we should be showing. And when I compare cooperativism and the way it's being accepted in the Canadian this sort of developed country status country, and how Black immigrants and Black Canadians use these cooperatives, and then the difference in the way these systems are treated to those in the Caribbean is quite stark. And that's perhaps why my book has been held up, because the Canadian system, Canada has a long legacy of cooperation, Underground Railroad, as Jessica just mentioned. But, all of these ROSCAs that Black immigrants and people, as long as they've been migrating for over 100 years to Canada, have been bringing these systems of cooperation. White Canadians also brought over the Caisse Populaire system to Canada that spread to the US, but there seems to be a cultural amnesia that people of color, particularly African people, and I would also say indigenous folks have their own systems of cooperation. They use different language, but they don't need to be taught about cooperation. There is a situated practice of self-management. However, Black Canadian women are being vilified. They are being ignored for their contributions to the solidarity and cooperative sector. I'm going to, maybe can I show this? Just 1 minute.
But also, so if you have it in your country, you still bring it. So when you go, you meet people from your country, you say, oh, you remember also? You say, yes. You remember when we used to read back home? So why don't we do it back?
So we developed a structure that was different. So
but also, so if you have it in your country, you still bring it. So when you go, you meet people from your country, you say, oh, you remember also? You say, yes. You remember when we used to read back home? So why don't we do it back?
So we developed a structure that was different, slightly different than the one that my mom and her friends used.
And you taught me and who have a group of 10 of women, so $200, I get $2,000.
That make me independent. I feel a power to have something. But also,
so, okay, so I have, I've been 7 minutes and I'm trying to rush through this. So basically what you're hearing, there's a film out there, it's, 20 minutes, it's in the world, it's open access, please get your hands on it, because who you're hearing from are these cooperative banker ladies that hail from Sierra Leone, Somalia, and Trinidad, who are actually starting a banker ladies council to realize a Rosca Federation. And that's where I see us coming together with Cooperation Africa, most definitely. And, when we think about cooperativism and we think about it as business and transactional, we should also think about the political implications it has. Women in Canada, second generation, third generation, are tapping into systems of Hagbad, which is a Rosca, or Pat Nahan, which is a Jamaican Rosca, to run political campaigns to ensure that they have voice in a formal system. Now get that. We are using cooperative, non-formal banking systems that are being vilified in the Canadian context to be able to run for political office, because running for political office here means you need to have a lot of money. And in spite all of that, these women are being vilified, their contributions are being ignored, they're dealing with extreme forms of anti-Black racism in the Americas, particularly in Canada and the US, and we don't even remunerate them. We don't configure them into our economic development programs when they're actually the experts that know how to do that work. So those kind of economic community development subsidies, philanthropy projects are taking the money without even finding a place for the banker ladies to be remunerated, which is quite shameful. And so what can be done? And I hope that this is where we have an extended conversation with Cooperation Africa. As you can see here in this quote by Fardosa, Somali-born Canadian, what she's saying is that people can look at them weirdly for having Hagbad, but they're going to continue to build a Hagbad bank in Canada. Whether Canadians are ready or not, whether we are being financed, we will figure out how to do this work, and we're doing it. And so the Banker Ladies Council knows that we have a lot to learn, both in from other places in the Global South. It's actually time for us to import expertise in global development from the South, who have excellent models of how to build an equity and inclusion into business systems, particularly from a solidarity and cooperative stand. Kerala, India has the Kudumbashree system. I'm happy that Dr. Chambas mentioned Kerala state with cooperativism. Ghana has a rich history of cooperatives, but particularly their Susu system. They formalized a very small bit of it, but they have pragmatic approach where they understand that Susu systems exist as part of the ecosystem. And South Africa has a network called NASASA, the National Stockville Association for South Africa. So we here in Canada, and hopefully expanding that movement, we'll be expanding it to include Roscas from around the world so that we actually have a place to legitimize what we're doing. And I believe that I'm going to stop there. Hope all of you can join us at the DICE Collective. We're really excited, all of us, to be a part and hopefully join and sign up with Cooperation Africa. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Professor Caroline Hossein. This is just amazing. And thank you for that little film and the links. Please share them so people can go to it. Professor Virginie Pérotin is the leading scholar on cooperative performance around the world, especially comparing their performance with that of investors-owned companies or publicly limited companies, which are normally found listed on the stock exchange. So this is who we are going to be listening. Please pay attention. Thank you so much for being here and being so patient with us. You have the floor.
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me. I'm so honored to be part of this momentous occasion. And thank you for the very kind introduction too. Worker cooperatives are often little known. So I'm going to speak about the results we have from statistical studies. There is very little data on worker cooperatives. We have, for example, CICOPA from back in 2016 gives slightly over 250,000 businesses that are pretty much worker cooperatives, with something like 12.5 million jobs, mostly for members, in a range of industries. Dr. Chambas has already mentioned contract labor and employment agencies. In other countries, workers' co-ops have enabled people to take over and continue businesses that had been abandoned by their owners. CICOPA listed back in 2016 5,300 worker-owned businesses for the whole of Africa, but with about 2.5 million jobs. I'm not sure how accurate that is. But the point is, for most places, most countries of most continents, we don't know much else. There's a small number of countries that have detailed data on worker cooperatives, and we've been doing sort of fancy statistical studies on these data for the last 40 years to try and pinpoint the behavior of worker cooperatives. But most of that handful of countries are high-income industrialized countries. So it's Italy, France, Spain. There's a little bit on the US and on the UK, Portugal recently. The exception is Uruguay, where there's a wonderful combination of fantastic data on co-ops, on workers' co-ops, and fantastic researchers. So they're doing some of the best empirical statistical work in the world on workers' co-ops right now. Now, so I'm in the odd position of talking about the way workers' co-ops can contribute to developing economies on the basis of studies carried out mostly on data from high-income industrialized economies, with the exception of Uruguay. Now, it does make sense for a couple of reasons. The first is that these studies, especially recent ones, use data on thousands of worker cooperatives and tens of thousands, or in the most recent ones, even hundreds of thousands of conventional businesses. And despite differences in the way workers' co-ops are set up from one country to another, changes quite a bit. Differences in time periods from early studies on small groups of co-ops in the UK or the US with data from the 1950s and 60s to recent studies on data from the 2010s in Southern Europe, widely differing time periods, firm samples, methodologies, and yet we have remarkably consistent findings. So I would say essentially what those findings say is that these are things that, as much as we can tell, we know about workers' co-ops. And it so happens that those findings actually suggest that worker cooperatives can provide valuable contributions to developing economies. So I'll go over as quickly as I can the major findings. Just a couple of basics first. So all the firms included in the studies on the worker co-op part, they are set up differently from one country to another, as I said, but most of the people working in the business own it. All firms of capital, the key issues with the classic co-op principle, one member, one vote, and all are for-profit businesses. So in those studies are not included, for example, non-profit social cooperatives from Italy or Spain that provide, or Belgium, that provide social services, for example. However, the for-profit motive is actually mitigated in practice in a lot of those companies by other goals like employment, for example. When we have detailed data, we find that they found pretty much in all industries. The only exception I've found is nuclear electricity generation, which, there are differences in the industry distribution of workers' co-ops between that distribution and the distribution of conventional firms. But those differences in industry distribution vary from one country to the next. So it's unclear there is any sort of simple story of specialization there. So the first question that people have been asking is, are workers' co-ops productive? There are two types of studies on this. The first type compares more democratic workers' co-ops with less democratic ones, in the sense of having more or fewer members among your workers. And the question was, are more democratic ones more productive? And the answer is largely yes. Yeah. So there is no study that finds a statistically significant cut in productivity from increased democracy. Some find no statistically significant effect. Most find statistically significant effects. And this is all else being equal, so taking into account the firm's size, its employment level, its industry, etc. I also found recently but it's not published yet, that in France, those workers' co-ops that had a narrower difference between the proportion of women among the members and the proportion of women on the board, that is more democratic in the sense that everybody has a voice, those were also more democratic, more productive, in addition to the usual thing. Also, most studies find that sharing more, all of them, sharing more profit increases productivity, which makes sense. Second type of studies compares workers' co-ops with other firms. And here, the question, of course, is, are worker cooperatives as productive or less or more than other firms? There are, okay, so the first thing that most studies find, is a small number of studies, is that worker cooperatives organize production differently from other firms. That is, taking into account their size, capital, etc., and industry, the mathematical, statistical relationship between what goes in, labor, capital, and all that, and production is different between co-ops and other firms. There are 5 studies. One recent on Portugal that finds there's no statistically significant difference between the productivity of workers' co-ops and other firms. The other four, one is on the US, it's a small group of plywood companies in the Pacific Northwest in the 60s and 70s, and 3 are in France with different time periods, different methodologies, different samples of conventional firms, and all of those find that workers' co-ops are more productive than conventional firms, all else being equal. On France, we found that there were several industries where if conventional businesses with their current employment and their current capital in their current industries and all that would produce more if they behaved like worker cooperatives, right? Now, the other question that people have been bothered about is, won't workers pay themselves high wages and run down the business instead of investing in worker cooperatives? Now, in a number of countries, at the request of the cooperative movement at the beginning of the 20th century, the law was introduced a clause requiring worker cooperatives to retain some profit, to put it in reserve by law every year. So in France, it's 15%, for example. And where that is the case, so I know the cases of Italy, France, and Spain, it turns out that worker cooperatives choose to retain a lot more than required. So in France, about 45%. Yeah. So essentially what they do is they keep more profit in the firm than the conventional business, in the firm and therefore also in the community and for investment later. It's a form of insurance, if you want. Yeah. There's no credible evidence of undercapitalization or low investment, effectively, but we have fewer countries that provide evidence of that. In France, we find same capital intensity, faster investment. Now, the other thing that worker co-ops do, of course, is they redistribute. They redistribute profit. As a result, okay, very few keep the same pay for everybody forever, but they have much, much narrower pay differentials than conventional businesses. So we're talking about, on average, something like 1 to 3 or 1 to 6, let's say, compared to an average of 1 to 150 in, you know, in Northern Europe, and that's just the average. Yeah, we're not talking about, you know, 1 to 1,500 and things like that. So much narrower. The way it's done is pays higher at the bottom and lower at the top. They also, and this is evidence, evidence on pay comes from Uruguay, Spain, and France, and a bit on Italy. They also have fewer managers and supervisors for the same workforce. But I have no stats on this. It just seems to be a regular finding that they provide more training, right? So you can see how, you know, with more training, reorganizing production, incentives with profit, I mean, it would make sense that they would be at least as productive as conventional businesses, yeah? You could also see why co-op members would want to keep those jobs, yeah? Hence the capital accumulation. And in effect, the other thing that is observed is that worker co-ops have greater employment stability, all else being equal, than conventional firms. And that, again, there are studies on this, several studies on Uruguay, and one on the same group of firms in the US, one on a very large number of firms and time period in Italy, and there is one that is not published yet on France that we are doing. They all, so worker co-ops are set up in quite different ways in these different places. But, sorry, I'm going over my time. I've tried to be quick. But they all find the same thing. When demand goes down, conventional firms cut jobs. worker cooperatives either cut nothing and use the money they've set aside in reserves, or if they start cutting anything, they cut pay before jobs. And they cut jobs less and later than conventional firms. It doesn't mean that workers necessarily have lower pay, because pay includes profit, and then they get the profit later on anyway. So they have greater employment stability. And now the other side of this is when demand grows, they increase employment less. But of course, when demand grows, other firms are hiring also. So there are a few potential advantages, and this is okay, because they also survive at least as well as other firms. It's common to see them survive more than well above a century. They have the same or lower closure rates. The best study, again on Uruguay, finds that workers' co-ops are more likely to survive, that much more likely to survive over a period of 13 years. They study them, that conventional businesses, and that's all else being equal. And the reason is greater employment stability, not lower pay. They don't have lower pay, so probably greater productivity. So the advantage is that worker cooperatives may have for developing economies, apart from productivity with democracy, is keeping more profit in the firm and therefore in the community. Not necessarily, that doesn't go with being undercapitalized. They may actually invest more, redistribution, and more stable employment. Thank you very much. Of course, the plea here is for data. Thank you. The survivor, at least as well.
Thank you so much, Professor Virginie. Thank you again. We are at the end, at the top of the hour. I do want to give back the floor to Caroline, Professor Caroline, before she leaves. Just 1 minute. You've seen some of the questions, maybe if there is anything that you want to address before you leave. The others have offered to stay a little longer, the next 10 minutes. So I just want to give you a few minutes.
No, I'm sorry, I have nothing else to add. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much. So we'll just take the next few minutes to hear again from those who have been listening to us. I know there's few questions in the Q&A and maybe a few hands raised if those questions were not resolved. So I just want to make sure we address a few of those before we close. It's been an amazing, amazing learning moment to listen to each of you. I'm going to go back to, I'm going to start backward. So you just stopped talking, I know, Professor Virginie Pérotin, but is there anything else you wanted to address that came up on the conversation?
I see a question from Juliet Kigo about, are there any pitfalls? Okay, two things I can think of. The main issue that we don't really have the answer to is creation, right? So we know that there are few workers' co-ops, not because they will die, that's not true, but we're not too sure yet what causes their creation. We know there are more created proportionately than conventional firms in recessions. We know there are more created where other worker co-ops exist, but that's about all we know at this stage. So we need, it's very difficult to get reliable data on this. I see somebody about the breakup of Yugoslavia. Oh, there are entire books about this. Essentially, the Yugoslavs didn't like talking about the ex-Yugoslavs didn't like talking about worker self-management anymore. And yeah, the other pitfall, no, it's not a pitfall, but it varies with the country. We've been trying to look at discrimination and equality within worker co-ops with the data that we have. And the data that we have for mostly Southern Europe doesn't include any data on ethnicity and race, because in France, for example, it's been banned since fascism in the Second World War, so it's complicated. But now they refuse to institute it for the time being. So we've only been looking at gender and at country of birth, which is of course a very bad indicator. As I know, being born in Reunion. But we find that the extent of pay discrimination compared with conventional firms, for example, by country of birth is about the same in Spain, whereas in Spain, women seem to be treated a bit better in workers' co-ops. But they have, there have been a lot of workers' co-ops in traditionally sectors with traditionally a lot of women. In France, we find, if I remember correctly, no clear difference by country of birth, but actually, if anything, the workers' co-ops are rather worse as far as gender discrimination. And this is all else being equal. Okay, so we need to work on this. But I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move right to Professor Jessica. Still with us? Yes. Anything you want to add or respond to?
So this has been a really great discussion. We could go on, but clearly I think it shows a need, right? We need to keep having these webinars and meetings. I think I just have two comments quickly, just actually on the recent stuff. I have anecdotal information about US worker co-ops, and one of the things I found in the US was the fastest growing sector of worker co-ops is women of color, actually, and especially immigrant women. So one of the studies that I tried to do about women in co-ops, it appears that women of color, especially Black women, but at this point in worker co-ops in the US, it's really Latinx women and African immigrant women. But they find that, right, they can control their income, control their work-life balance, et cetera, much better by being in a worker co-op, right? In addition to, a group like Cooperative Home Care Associates, where they can actually raise the living to almost a living wage for women in home care work, which, used to be horribly contingent and a very low paying, et cetera. Now they can get full-time jobs, they can move up in the co-op, they can get living wages, they can get retirement funds and all kinds of things by being in a worker co-op. So I do think I agree that we need more data because we need to figure out ways to capture those kind of things. But for me, it was really interesting that Black women and women of color were able, especially in the co-ops where they were leading and where they were predominant, they actually could get around a lot of the capitalist patriarchal issues and oppressions that they had. So I think there's a lot of promise if we could, again, understand it more, learn it more, if we had more data, but definitely the anecdotal data is really important here. And that kind of thing. And the only other thing I saw some comments about, right, do we really want to totally formalize the informal banker ladies and susus and the informal economic cooperation and solidarity? And I think that's worth maybe a whole webinar or session or something, because I'm not sure. I think there's pros and cons, right? We know that because we're in a world capitalist system, a racial gendered capitalist system, that when we try to do things and formalize things, the capitalist system sometimes takes it over. And so that's some of the people who were saying, do we really want to formalize these things? I think they were worried about that. What does that mean? Will it really work, or will we take away the uniqueness when we formalize it. On the other hand, because it's informal, we don't see it as much. We don't have as many protections for it. We don't have as much respect for it. And it's usually women, again, doing formal work, and it's unrecognized and invisible and underpaid and that kind of thing. So I do think we need a good conversation among people, us from the global South or whatever, to talk about this, because we need to figure out what is the best way to perpetuate and protect and, and get the most out of these kinds of solidarity economics.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. Right back to Brian. Few minutes to tell us a little bit more and also to address any of these questions you have.
Thanks, Coumba. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, you can.
So these questions of what leadership is necessary to control knowledge, financing, technology, institutions, policies, and representation of those who actually are the originators of cooperative economies. I think the first is a reimagination of Pan-African regional developmentalism that centers solidarity economies or cooperatives. And that reimagination, I think, can only be led by Pan-African feminists, African primary producers, smallholders, creatives, and progressive petty bourgeois like ourselves here. The second is, of course, the African Union and African Development Bank, in my view, and the ADB should be coerced to become primary supporters of African and Pan-African cooperative development and the development of solidarity economies that are both local, national, regional, and international across different sectors. And the third is African states must be pushed, as must the IMF and the World Bank, to adopt progressive and transformative taxation and overall development financing that supports co-ops as a critical private sector actor and contributor to intangible assets without necessarily having to change their form. And the third, of course, is centering these questions of equity, equality, diversity, and inclusion, addressing questions of class, gender, and generation. And the fourth, quickly, I think Agenda 2063 must be revisited in order to give cooperation or cooperatives a stronger place that focuses on the subjects that I think Adote and the Cooperative Africa have put forward: research and support infrastructure, backward and forward linkages into both local economic development and regional economic development, including a more progressive version of the AFCFTA. And lastly, I think Pan-African economic internationalism that W.B. Du Bois, that Gavi and others talked about, has its moment now with the awakening. Africans, African migrants, and Afro descendants should optimize benefits of co-ops in digital and tech economies, in using public banking as an alternative, and also African philanthropies and social impact investment vehicles, as well as transnational expertise that's available. I think that we talk about South-South, but I think we need to reimagine what this means in a practical way. Ultimately, I think both Professor Jessica and Virginie, when they were talking, the issue of representation. Policies are not going to change until we deal with the question of representation in local government and in parliament by folks who understand how a transformative economy works and why cooperatives are central to it.
Thank you so much, Brian. We only have now a few seconds. I just want to use them to say thank you so much to Prof. Virginie, Prof. Jessica, to Brian, to Prof. Caroline, and I understand that each of you, we need about, more than the 2 hours for each of you to really have deep conversation on what you presented. But the fact that Adote has told us that we want to set a series, and if you'd be welcome to come back on series where we specifically talk about some of these issues, would be really amazing. So I want to give you the floor, Adote, to close up, just to say a few words again to all of those who came and joined us today. Thank you. We will share this video on social medias and so on, so people can see it who've missed it and people who had to go. Thank you to the interpreters, to the people who did the technical work for us to be able to be here. And of course, to all the 54 members of Cooperation Africa who started it up. And Adote, I have to name my friend Amina Mama. I'm here because she called me. So Adote, just a few seconds to close.
Okay, I'll be very, very quick. I want to just join in the thanking our speakers today. I think anybody who's wanted to learn about cooperatives would have learned a great deal. And I really want to thank you all for your contributions. Thank you very much. I just want to touch on three things very quickly. I mentioned them one already. That is, we need to, as much as possible, try and get our governments to institute a legal framework that, if not inhibiting, or at least if not encouraging, at least not inhibiting cooperative formation. I think that's one. Number two, it would be good if we, in our business schools, this is at the academic level, that we include teaching about different business forms. It is so narrow and limiting when you go to a regular university, that the only kind of business form that you will be taught is the investor-owned business, is the public limited company, as the dominant form. That should stop. And the last thing I just want to point out is about the role of civil society. We talked about Spain, about Mondragon. It was started by this inspiration behind it was a Catholic priest, the local Catholic priest in Arrasate, in Mondragon. In Italy, there were Italy, in fact, has, in terms of concentration, there's a region of Italy called Emilia Romagna, has the greatest concentration of cooperatives of anywhere in the world. And that was started by civil society organizations, by trade unions and the local church. In India, the largest cooperative there, again, was started by civil society. So what I'm saying is that do not put too much weight on expecting our governments to do this thing. If we want it, if progressive people say they want it, we must do it. Yeah, we must do it for ourselves. That is the bottom line. And so let me end with that and say, thank you, Coumba, you have been thanking everybody, but thank you for chairing this, moderating these sessions. And as I said, in the weeks to come, we will start a regular program where we will discuss these issues, all issues around cooperatives, cooperative principles, cooperative practice, and so that we all learn together what we need to do to make this vision a reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Thank you.